Absolutely delighted to be here, and I have a really special guest for you this month, our first one this series. And what I want to do is really we're going to look at the science of flourishing. We're going to look at how to unleash your best self. And before we do that, as you know, if you're regular viewers, what I really like to do is create a little bit of stillness. So, Nick, this is going to help you too in terms of really just coming into presence, coming into mindfulness before we really dig deep. So, what we'll do as you come in is just take some time to really let go of your day, whatever has been going on, or Nick is in the middle of his day, but whatever has gone before, whatever will come after, it's really just a case for you to really take this time and make the most of it for yourself. Please do interact as much as you possibly can. The polls are already live, so we've questions there for you. If you want to put in a question in particular for Nick, what I would recommend is you put it in the Q&A box. And if we have time, I imagine we'll be having so much to talk about, but if there is time, Nick will answer that from the Q&A box directly. We will also really spend some time just before we begin looking at what does flourishing mean to you. I think it's good to define it personally for yourself. What does it mean to you to flourish? What does the word even mean? And just to give the heads up for Nick, like in Ireland, when we ask people, how are you? We often just say grand. Okay, so grand is this kind of blanket term that means okay. It means we're not too good, we're not too bad, but we generally don't say we're great. We say grand. So grand is kind of the standard response. So just to keep that in mind as we're going through this. So without further ado, let's take our 3 deep breaths. This is something I always do, Nick, with whatever I'm doing. I always like to create some stillness before we commence. So closing down the eyes for a moment, if you're comfortable to do so, and take a full breath, a conscious breath in through the nose. Feel the belly expand, and then exhale fully out through the mouth. Just allowing everything to soften, everything to relax. Allowing your full attention to come into this moment. We take a second breath in through the nose. Now really fill the belly as much as you can, as deep as you can. And then a lovely long exhale out through the mouth. As you exhale, you can just imagine you're releasing and you're letting go of whatever you need to, so you can bring your full attention for the next 60 minutes of learning, of insights, of unleashing your best self. And then we'll take that third breath in your own time, as deep as you can, the deepest yet, right into the belly. And that lovely slow and long exhale through the mouth. Really nice. And in our own time, opening up the eyes again. So, Nick, what I'd love to do, I'm going to have to read this because your bio is so long that for me to go through it with by memory is just going to be too much. So I'm going to read this for everyone here this evening. So Dr. Nick Holton, our special guest from the USA tonight, is a consultant, coach, speaker, and author. And he focuses on scientific research that facilitates and supports optimal functioning, a synergistic development of both peak performance and overall happiness and satisfaction. He has worked with NBA athletes, Fortune 500 businesses, as well as individuals from some of the most well-known firms in the world. His work is global. It certainly is now. You're here in Ireland, having trained, spoken to, and written for audiences from around the US, Europe, India, Australia, Singapore, Mexico, South America, and many more. In addition to reviewing manuscripts for the Journal of Happiness, sounds like a great journal, Dr. Holton is also a member of the American Psychological Association and the International Positive Education Network. So there is a brief intro. I know there's more on your bio, but I just took those kind of key pertinent points to help the audience here know more about your work. And we're sharing there your website for people also. So Nick, I suppose the question I have for you and for everyone here in the chat box, really, the first one is, what does flourishing mean to you?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me, Fiona. It's a pleasure to be here and be with your audience and all of you. And looking forward to our chat today. And I'll kind of be keeping an eye on the chat itself for any questions you might have that come up. Yeah, that's the core question, right? And I love that you've opened us up with it because it is to flourish, I think, is a highly subjective endeavor in many ways. And yet we also have, I think, some like good science-backed objective components of what most people would say flourishing should include. So the kind of core definition I would use is that you are able to build the good, you are able to navigate the bad, or more specifically, the unpleasant, and you are able to perform more or less optimally day to day, week to week, month to month. That doesn't mean robotic, that doesn't mean perfect. You know, we all have our flaws and things that we're working on. But generally, you can sync up that building of the good, navigating of the bad, and that consistent optimal performance in ways that have you living a life that is deeply satisfying and rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. So navigating the bad is sort of equally as important, would you say? Because when we think of positive psychology, often people
Mm-hmm.
just think it's like one kind of, it's all Pollyanna, positive, without really looking at obviously the other side of it, which is our difficult emotions, our negative emotions, and how, like you said, part of it, flourishing, is actually not just navigating them, but I would imagine also accepting them and learning from them also. Would that be true to say, do you think, Nick?
100%. So in my work around anti-fragility for my company, the Anti-Fragile Academy, and then a consistent theme across my podcasts with world-renowned experts, right? Tal Ben-Shahar, Todd Kashdan, Anna Lemke, we see something that I think is really consistent and really important, and it's not necessarily quote unquote positive or pleasant, right? And that is there is utility in unpleasantness. And so I tend to steer away from language like positive and negative emotions. Anyone familiar with Susan David as well has talked a lot about this, written a lot about this. What I think we see from the research is what we should want anyway is psychological richness, right? Plenty of pleasantness, a preponderance of pleasantness, if you will,
Mhm.
but not just the ability, the actual willingness to engage in unpleasantness, right? That's going to give you sort of the most expansive and in many cases well-rounded life. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not talking about wishing for, asking for, engaging in things that cause trauma. What we are talking about, though, is understanding that you're missing out on an entire aspect of life if we are constantly focusing on the positive and constantly obsessed with feeling good. We actually can paradoxically and kind of counterintuitively make it harder to feel good. So there really needs to be, I think, an awareness of and a strategic effort to seesaw or kind of teeter totter, if you will, as we'd say here in the States.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. I love that phrase, the idea of the utility of negative emotions. Because this series is called Building Emotional Resilience. And
Yeah.
to be resilient, in my mind, so much of it is actually about being able to not just tolerate negative emotion, not just accept it, but really to embrace it and to learn what is it teaching us? What is underneath that anxiety, for example, or that anger or that frustration, because when we're skilled, and you were talking about Susan David, isn't that right? The emotional agility, that idea of being able to kind of
Yep.
have this flexibility towards our emotions and to take away labels, I think is fantastic. That we're not no longer looking at it through that lens that's so binary, isn't it? Either positive or negative. Um,
Yep.
so is there much research in this, Nick, in terms of the the utility, as you said, of negative emotions? Like, is there much that has been done?
Well, listen, there's a lot of research, and let's talk about it just in practical terms, right? Daily experiences. first. So I'll give you the research first, and without trying to cite just all the specific studies, let me give you 3 or 4 books that I think will articulate the point. You just mentioned one, Emotional Agility, Susan David, PhD. Another one, The Upside of Your Dark Side, co-written by Todd Kashdan, who is one of the world's foremost well-being researchers, and Robert Biswas Diener, who you probably know as the son of Ed Diener, and again, another prominent well-being researcher. So these are 2 big well-being researchers writing a book about unpleasant emotion, right, and the utility
Wow.
of it.
Yeah, yeah.
On the neuroscience side, you've got Dopamine Nation by Anna Lemke. Anyone that's seen The Social Dilemma on Netflix, right? She's an advisor for that. She was in it. She's an addiction specialist out of Stanford. Talks a lot about the dopamine reward system and how we have to engage in unpleasantness. Paul Bloom's book, The Sweet Spot, talks a lot about this and differences between pleasantness, unpleasantness, happiness versus meaning. So those would be really, really good places to start. I'm sure I'm forgetting another one somewhere, but those would be great.
They're
But
wonderful. Yeah.
just in practical terms, think of it this way. I mean, if anyone on the call is like me, you succumb to the occasional procrastination, right? And so what happens towards the end of a period of procrastination? Well, stress and anxiety. Well, what does that stress and anxiety often do? It doesn't feel good, but it actually motivates you. It focuses you. It engages that executive attention network in a way that drives behavior and drives processing and allows you to complete your work, right?
Yeah, that's a great
We
example
take
because I think procrastination, Nick, is something so many people suffer from, isn't it? And knowing that the unpleasantness, if you like, is something you can actually reframe as a way to motivate yourself to move forward, I think is so helpful. So for
that
procrastinators out there, it's worth noting.
that's another the upside of stress is the other book I knew I was forgetting.
Wow.
Kelly McGonigal will talk a lot about that cognitive appraisal or that framing mechanism. That's a key piece I think to flourishing is a mindset that you develop around unpleasantness, right? So when stress shows up, is this something I need to run from, or is this something I need to lean into and figure out a way to use, right, and leverage to my advantage?
Yeah, absolutely. But would you say, Nick, that generally speaking, people are so reluctant to do that as soon as they feel the unpleasantness, there's either a suppression or there is a distraction or there is a denial or that it's highly skilled, isn't it, really, to be able to implement that. I mean, I think we can understand it intellectually, but what would you say to someone how, when they are feeling these things, how can they actually kind of navigate it in real time, if you like, in daily life?
It's a great question. So you could probably do this in layers, right? So if the first layer is mindset, that's as Aaliyah Crum would call this, a bridge between the conscious and subconscious mind. So what's the conscious piece? Actually just stopping to think about examples of where unpleasant feelings are actually good for us or helpful to us. So what does being able to do that actually require? Well, level 2, you've got to have the ability to identify and accurately label what it is that you're experiencing, right? And
Yeah,
so that literally means developing emotional vocabulary, an emotional lexicon, right? Which a lot of people don't necessarily take the time to do.
yeah,
So mindset first, right? Specific sort of emotion identification skills second. And then third becomes a little more nuanced. Do you need to play with some of the more practical tools, cognitive behavioral technique? You mentioned acceptance commitment technique, playing with gratitude, playing with benefit finding out of positive psych, right? These different worlds
mm,
where you can sort of press on those buttons and press on those levers, right? So that's hopefully from mindset first, then okay, how do I think about label identify feelings, and then more specifically on a skill level, what do I do with those feelings that will still be values aligned? Sometimes that might be diffusing them and trying to eliminate or dampen them. Sometimes that might be leaning in, accepting them, right, using them as leverage. But
yeah.
that's going to depend on your values, intensity, context, things of that nature.
Sure, yeah, yeah. But I think that even knowing that there is a sort of reward, if you like, back to the positive, back to the pleasure seeking sort of drive within us, that if we have that information, we're more likely to go to that place, to go into those darker places, because we can see that this is actually, there is a benefit to this, there is a reason for this, and it's going to help me in terms of whether it's goals or whether it's relationships or any of the different ways that it can help improve our lives. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of fun. We're talking about flourishing, and we spent a good bit of time talking about, these more,
Absolutely.
yeah, but really, really important, I think, and something that maybe needs to be said more and more in terms of clearing up any misconceptions around what it is. Um, so one of the quotes I know that you love and I've seen on your website, etc., and it's a great quote, is the story of humankind is the story of men and women selling themselves short, and that's by Abraham Maslow. Um, talk to me a little bit about that. Why is it that quote really, struck you as so much that you kind of have it as a banner for, the work that you do, or, a kind of lead into the work you do?
Because all of this flourishing, well-being, pause psych, anti-fragility, like neuroscience, it's
Mhm.
to me, it's all about human potential, right? Why do we study ourselves? We're trying to get better. We're trying to create better. We're trying to live better lives, right? Why do we coach, consult, speak? Why do you host these webinars, right? We're trying to help people be better versions of themselves, right? As a longtime educator, that quote really stuck out to me because I've always felt if we could get this sort of science and practices and contexts and behavior change into, say, schools or systems like that, you can transform entire societies, entire countries can transform the world, right? So it was really coming in some ways from an education perspective, but as a, like I said, coach, consultant, advisor, that hits the nail on the head of what we're trying to do, right? Get people to stop selling themselves short and then give them tools to actualize sort of the best versions of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose what I'm particularly interested in that idea of selling themselves short, that there is something there that holds people back, if you like, from, maybe believing that I deserve as much as anybody else, not more, not less, but that I also deserve to flourish in this world, not just to survive, not just to be at that baseline. If you go back to Maslow's work, and how the pyramid and starting at the very basic and moving up to self-actualization, it's like that is something I think that we all are worthy of. And do you think that could be something that holds people back? That there's a kind of um, a sense of saying that's not necessarily for me, or maybe this is more a cultural thing. Maybe this is an Irish kind of sense of holding back.
So the cultural piece is really interesting because, and it sort of brings us back to the original question, what does it actually mean to flourish? Right.
Mm,
Well, okay. So I've defined it one way, but if you defined it as strictly thinking about those five components of PERMA or the six components on the Harvard Individual Flourishing Measure or Carol Riff's 130 some items, right, on her psychological well-being scale, you're going to get, I think, really different interpretations. So, I happen to be married into a Vietnamese family, right? You can see very different cultural, I think, interpretations of what it means, whether you should even care about happiness versus meaning, which is maybe a little bit more service oriented and can oftentimes be communal. Should we be trying to individually thrive or flourish with no recognition of ecosystem or environment, right? Or economic surroundings, those sorts of things, right? Should it
mhm.
be a me endeavor versus a we endeavor? So I think some of those cultural implications that have to be strongly considered when anyone steps back and says, how do I need to flourish? Or before I even like, do I deserve to? Like, do I deserve to do what? What is the what that we're talking about when we say flourishing? Then we can step back and say, okay, do I deserve that? How do I create that? Right? How do I bring that into my life?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So let's just put that out there into the chat again. So please do let us know, like, what do you see flourishing as? Because I think we're learning that it is very subjective. As you say, there's lots of frameworks and lots of models, but I think knowing what it means to you is actually what really matters. And then how do we look at that in the greater scheme of things in terms of, you know, I would say that when an individual flourishes, it's incredibly uplifting, not just for that person, but for everyone who is in a relationship with that person. That it's a gift to others also, in terms of you being your best self is a gift to your loved ones, it's a gift to your work colleagues, it's a gift to everyone, because you are lighter and more able to communicate effectively. You have that emotional intelligence, which I think can save a lot of unnecessary drama and potential trauma for people. So, um, you know, when we look at that, I think it's important. So just let me know in the chat, what do you think it is? I think somebody up there said stillness. Am I right? I think somebody said time for stillness. So there we go. You know, I think that's really worth identifying, isn't it? And if it is for you time for stillness, which I think for me personally would be a big part of it as well, to flourish is to have that time for stillness in your mind and freedom from thought and activity, um, is to find a practical way to implement that. Isn't that right? It's like kind of to hold yourself accountable in some way. How can I actually bring that into my life? Um, so here's some more coming in. Hi, Mary, how are you? Chasing goals and dreams, big and small, with a belief that it could happen. Self-development and self-actualization, lovely. Orla, welcome. Growth mindset. I imagine a beautiful garden in bloom with all ecosystems working in harmony. That's pretty nice, isn't it? Leslie, welcome. My own interpretation has been stated here quite well. It's the ability to access and grow positivity mindset while also creating the skills to navigate harder issues that life throws at you. It's not a static place where you arrive, it's always ongoing. That's lovely, Leslie, isn't it? And pretty well observed, I think.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, really, really great. Thank you for that. So in terms of the principles. You mentioned the PERMA model, and I think that for people here, it might be really helpful to just break that down a little bit more for them. So this is Martin Seligman's PERMA model. Would you talk us through that a little bit, Nick?
I will. I want to front end and say that there are multiple models. I am model agnostic and candidly find myself using PERMA less and less, but I'm happy to talk through, I think, some of its redeeming qualities. I'll also mention people should take a look at Harvard's individual flourishing metric. There's a lot of different things out there, and it might actually be worthwhile to just give a little bit of context in terms of
Please
how you might
do.
think about happiness or well-being in general. And this will be a little nerdy, but I think still useful in setting a foundation. A lot of people on the call have maybe heard the term hedonism, right? Hedonia. And so a hedonist, or someone who is hedonically happy, tends to have, really, like, simply, a greater ratio of pleasant emotion or positive emotion to unpleasant, right? There's a couple things to say about that. One, it's worthwhile to have some of those experiences because it's worthwhile pursuing pleasant or positive emotion. It creates what we know as a well-being boost. We become better at just about everything. We're kinder, we're more active citizens, we're more resilient, we're more motivated. There's just a lot of good things that come from pleasant emotion.
Hmm.
However, there are plenty of studies that will show that a hedonistic life will not statistically correlate with a satisfied life. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. Like, okay, I could feel good a lot of the time. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to feel satisfied, according to the science.
Hmm.
So then you look at what I wrote my dissertation on, which is eudaimonia, right? Eudaimonia. This is a meaning-based happiness. So this does statistically correlate with life satisfaction. So this is about cultivating one's virtues, finding ways to tap into purpose, to kind of give back to the things that you care about deeply in life. And you say, okay, well, why would those behave differently? And I'll give you just a great example from Paul Bloom's book that I mentioned earlier. You look at studies of new parents. Maybe we got
Hmm.
some parents on the call.
Hmm.
Happiness goes down,
Hmm.
meaning goes up.
Hmm.
Right? Well, what's the difference there? Well, meaning tends to have actually a bit more unpleasantness. We talked about the utility of unpleasantness along with it as well. Like there's an element of sacrifice and kind of grinding it out and really having to earn it. Hedonism is joy and amazement and awe and surprise and again psychologically rich. There's a place for that, but they're very different. What's life satisfaction? Life satisfaction is static, right? It's not changing as much as hedonia or subjective well-being, right? You could have a really bad day and be hedonically unhappy. That won't necessarily impact overall life satisfaction, right? So why do I bring those up? Back to PERMA. PERMA is in the chat here, right? Thank you, Karen. PERMA, and you'll see different iterations of it as well. The first one, pleasant emotion, is the hedonic life, right? It's having some of that hedonism, pursuing pleasantness for pleasantness sake, and because of all the cool things that it can bring and then indirectly cause, right?
Hmm. So to ask you a
Second,
question there, Nick,
yeah,
on
sure.
hedonism, I'm interested because there is a kind of, again, maybe it's a bit of a misconception, but that hedonism is there's almost a negative sort of quality to it, or idea that it's just pure pleasure seeking, that it's all external, that it's kind of like in extremes, like, that someone who's like eating and drinking and, the sort of living this or constantly on holiday, or, that there's an extreme sense of it. But what I think you're talking about is much more the actual, let's say, the emotion that is caused through the activity rather than the activity itself. Am I correct about that? If that makes
Well,
sense.
so let's break it down in two slightly different ways here. So, first of all, it's fair to say that some academics will argue that hedonia and eudaimonia, or other forms of happiness, aren't actually different, right? So, for instance, could you engage in something that creates meaning and also creates a lot of pleasantness? Sure. Well, then why isn't that hedonistic as well, right? But that's not necessarily here or there. It's just kind of saying like, let's be careful about splitting the lines too clearly, because some people would push back against that, which is part of the fun of science.
Mhm.
The neuroscience piece here, sort of the explanation, is interesting to get into, and I mentioned Anna Lembke and sort of that seesaw piece, right? So if somebody is purely hedonistic, then in neurochemical terms, what that typically means is a lot of dopamine hits. Okay. Now, why is that important? Because we all have a baseline level of dopamine, right?
Mhm.
And the experience of sometimes joy or happiness or amazement or surprise or novelty, that is neurochemically the boost from that baseline, right? So we get more dopamine as a result of those things. Well, if you're constantly pursuing it, meaning you're constantly up where the boost is,
Mhm.
right? Then
Mhm.
counterintuitively, what happens is it doesn't feel like a jump. It doesn't feel like anything. It starts to feel like the baseline.
Yeah.
And so what happens is a hedonist never lets themselves teeter totter the other way, in the most extreme form, of course, right? There's variations in between. And if they never let themselves teeter totter the other way, they're not going to get that same sense of satisfaction. It's the same idea as tolerance, right? I'm probably talking to a majority Irish crowd. I'm going to make some assumptions culturally. Maybe we can appreciate the idea of tolerance, right?
Mhm.
Spend a week or two or three, not going to the pub, not having the pint, and then go back, have it, and then see how you feel, right? It's a different level of hit. And that's what the hedonist potentially locks themselves out of.
Okay. So it's kind of, again, they're going to be in a state of striving and pushing for more, which is where I think that idea of a hedonistic lifestyle is one where it's purely just it's pleasure rather than it's never really going to give you that satisfied feeling if it's in isolation, essentially.
It is the neurochemical version of a dog chasing its tail.
Oh,
You
all right,
never
that sums
quite
it up
catch it.
brilliant.
I'm a dog guy. You never quite catch it.
Yeah, yeah. So it's
And if you
quite a
do, it's temporary.
yeah, which is quite unfortunate, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
It's
Yes.
a sad place to be in. And I think we can all sort of feel like that at different times in our lives where maybe we were caught in that in some way. So yeah, that really makes sense. So sorry, you were going with the PERMA model and I interrupted you there. So you were
Oh no,
talking,
yes.
yes,
So you've got the P, pleasant hedonism, right? Great. You got
okay,
the E, eudaimonia or engagement, as it stands for in PERMA,
yeah.
which is really kind of split into two definitions or subcategories. One is character. So the development of character, the alignment of character to behaviors, which is what we call psychologically as coherence. That's the We're all going to understand it. You know, when you do stuff in life that feels out of character or out of line with how you'd like to be, and you feel kind of crappy about it, that's incoherence, right? So identifying those values and those virtues that matter most to us, part of that is engagement. The other form of engagement is flow, the flow state. So this
Mhm.
can be kind of a performance state, a euphoric state. Done a lot of coaching and consulting around there, but for the listeners, it's getting lost in deeply immersive, what we call autotelic activities done for their own sake, right? Hobbies, passions, interests, where you just sort of, lose the time, literally gets distorted, sense of
Mhm.
self gets distorted, the prefrontal cortex shuts down a little bit, redirects energy, and you just sort of get lost. So that's the E.
Yeah.
So pleasant emotion, right?
Mhm.
Character and flow.
Mhm.
The R is by far and away, we've had Mark Schultz onto the podcast. He's the associate director of the longest running study on human happiness out of Harvard. What does he
Mhm.
tell you in their book, The Good Life? Single
Mhm.
most important predictor of happiness worldwide and life satisfaction worldwide is the quality of social connection and relationships, right? It's people. We see this in workplace settings too a lot, by the way. A lot of times job satisfaction numbers are correlated with liking the people we work with and for.
Yeah.
So that's the R. What does relationships break down to in practical terms? Family, friends, community, intimacy, partner, something along those lines. I got a little lag there. Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah, we can still hear you. You lagged, but we could hear you, so it was fine. No problem.
Still got me okay, Fiona?
Still got you. Yeah, you're still here. Can you hear us, Nick?
Are you back?
Yeah.
Yes, there
Yeah.
was, it
Yeah.
froze on my end for a second there. Okay.
Oh, okay.
All right. So all I was saying was relationships, family, friends, community, intimacy, or partner. Those tend to be the categories, right? But I mean, you can get it from work friends and colleagues, religious community, sports community, all sorts of different things, right? So then the M is meaning. You can sort of amend this to also put it in layperson terms, mattering, right?
Mhm.
That's one way we access meaning. What do we mean by mattering? Having some sense of purpose, having some sense of how the me connects to the we. So, how do my interests, my talents, my limitations, my context, my values get bundled up and used to contribute to someone or something other than myself? A we, right? That's what purpose is. And you think about some of the evolutionary rationale. Just if you didn't matter, if you didn't have that purpose, I mean, candidly, you might get left behind. So we're driven to matter to the people that matter to us, right? For a
Yeah.
whole host of reasons.
Mhm.
And then the A, and this is where there's a lot of contentiousness is a strong word, but certainly debate around this one. A, achievement. Um, what I would do is sort of say self-esteem and a sense of competency, right?
Mhm.
What Carol Riff, who we mentioned earlier, would call environmental mastery. Like a sense that I feel safe in and can navigate my environment. I can do intentional behaviors. I can set goals and accomplish those goals. I can
Mhm.
help myself sort of grow, those sorts of things, right?
Having connected Nick into agency, because I know Martin Seligman speaks a lot about this, having a sense of agency of our own life. Would that be part of it? The A there, the achievement, would it be connected, do you think?
That's a totally coherent argument. Yeah, I mean, agency, or if you want to boil it down to something like self-efficacy, what is self-efficacy? It's the belief in our own ability to do something, right? That's
Yes.
fundamental to agency. Well, what is one of the main sources of our belief in our ability to do something? we've done it already, right? We've done it before. So a lot of times our belief or our growing levels of efficacy and confidence are
Mhm.
actually built upon past experiences of
Mhm.
success, right? And vice versa when it comes to failure, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. Okay, no, that's really helpful. Just to say to people, please do vote in the polls. I'll read them now in a moment just to see what's going on. There's a comment here from Leslie. She says, "As for the dog, I'm laughing. Why bother chasing your tail? You've already got it. It's you." So that's absolutely, yeah, that's the sense of your own purpose within yourself rather than looking externally. That's lovely, Leslie. Um, just to go back for a moment there, in terms of relationships, Nick, you know, you mentioned various different types of relationships, right? So let's say with this model, and I know it's just a framework and, there are other ones, etc. But especially because the longest study, as we know in happiness, has identified the people in our lives, our relationships as being the indicator of our overall happiness. Um, is it important that we have that variety that you mentioned there in terms of the different types of relationships? Is there science there to show that, yes, we maybe, have a happy marriage, a good partner, but is there a sense of that all of the other types of relationships, good family relationships with our family of origin, our parents, our siblings, our friendships, would they also be sort of in part of this, or does it really matter? Do you know? Because it's quite interesting.
So I've not heard, and it doesn't mean they're not out there. I have not
Yeah.
heard or been made aware of arguments around variety being sort of a moderating variable. I have heard arguments about quality
Mm.
and to a certain extent, minimum number, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So whether or not the quality of those relationships or minimum number is divided up equally among family, friends, partner, whatever it might be, I'm
Mm.
not sure. Um, what I would encourage everyone to do is, and I don't mean to be, overly utilitarian or crass about this, but what purpose do the relationships serve? So, for instance, you might get certain emotional experiences and growth experiences and reflections and whatever it might be from time with your partner, right? And there's a rich amount of those that I would get from, sharing my life with my wife.
Mhm.
That's very different than the sort of emotions and experiences and things that I expose myself to and go through when I'm hanging out with close friends,
Mhm.
right? Or family. You think about it really simply. Um, some people make you laugh, others make you think, others make you love, others, make you frustrated in a good way, though. They nudge you to grow, right?
Mhm.
So what you might do is actually, and again, I mentioned Mark Schultz. There's a great example of this in their book, The Good Life. Start a relationship dashboard, right? So on one axis, it's how much time do I spend with these people, and
Mhm.
on the other axis, it's how much time do I actually want to spend with them, or how do they contribute to my life, and just kind of place some of the people in your life around that board.
Mhm.
Well, find ways to spend more time with certain people, and I'm not saying just cut people out of your life, but be strategic about the time and intentionality you spend with people that are on the other side of the board. And you can combine this with the emotional intelligence and vocabulary and lexicon I mentioned earlier, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Man, I really could just use a relaxing dinner and a good laugh. I'm going to call up friend A, right?
Mhm.
I just want to kind of stay in, chill out, watch a movie, but I'd rather not, be alone. I'm going to call, my sibling, whatever it might be.
Mhm.
So, being thoughtful and strategic about it in that way, I think can go a long way.
Yeah, and it's not something we ever really give much time to. Like, I think I saw on one of your podcast or heard on Instagram a clip from one of your podcasts, and they were speaking about this and the idea that you would actually, really be uh, mindful about who you want to spend time with, and that
Mm-hmm.
because it is one of the greatest regrets of the dying is that we haven't spent enough time with the people we love, is that we are as strategic about it as we would be about our fitness, for example. That we put in, like, I have my yoga classes put into my calendar,
Right,
for
right.
example, but that you actually put in, time with this person, time with that person, because if we don't, it's like it can just slip away, can't it? And that's where the regret can come in. You know, the idea that I haven't seen that person for months or even years at this stage, and I would love to see them.
Not just regret, yes, and 100% to everything you just said. And in the present, because if regret is about the future but looking back at the past, right, then the present in terms of flourishing, mental health, well-being, and however you want to call it, one
Mm.
of the single greatest, kind of most harmful things to all of that is loneliness. And that's a really, really important piece to pull out, because what is loneliness? It is simply a gap between needs and the perception that those needs have been met, right? So introverts still generally need and want social connection. They just go about it in a different way with different people, and it tends to have different impacts or effects, right? You could be completely extroverted around people all the time and still feel lonely. It's about having the people that you feel like see you, know you, get you is the phrase you'll often hear, at least here in the States, right? And
Yeah, we say that. Yeah.
yeah, that you feel like you are authentically connected to and belong with. And that doesn't necessarily mean time spent, right? But it typically does suggest quality of time, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I think that's really helpful. So as a practical thing for people here, that's something that you could start to implement into your life is to do this board, as you say, and really question, as you said, not by being sort of throwing people out of your life or being dismissive, but really asking, what is the purpose of this? And am I seeing this person enough? How can I see them more? And that will then, of course, be a huge contributor to your overall well-being and your happiness.
Can I
Um,
mention one more piece on this, actually?
Please
So
do,
sorry
Nick.
to
Yeah.
interject, but I don't want it to come across extractive either, like a taker relationship, right? Like there's a lot to be said
Mhm,
for Stephen Post's book, right? Why Good Things Happen to Good People. There's a
mhm,
lot to be said for a good, healthy, flourishing life being oftentimes centered around giving behavior. So pro-social behavior, altruistic behavior. Sometimes the best way to take care of ourselves is to take care of somebody else.
mhm.
So you might also look at that dashboard, and if you see that there's people you spend less time with, or they make you, feel a certain way, well, that doesn't necessarily mean avoid and only focus on the people you can extract pleasantness from. Maybe there needs to be some sacrifice or some compromise or willingness to endure some of the difficulties that come with giving and supporting. There's an argument to be made for that scientifically, as well as morally, I think, and
As
philosophically.
well as morally, yeah, and it's a
Sure.
little bit like we were saying at the top of the call in terms of that, learning from the challenging. So if you do find someone challenging, it's like, well, what is it about them that I find so difficult, and how can I actually learn from that to again to improve myself, to be more maybe patient or whatever it
Yes.
might be. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. I'm just going to read these polls now and see what we're getting back. So basically, the first one is, do you feel you are flourishing in your life? So basically, people have said 60% say somewhat, 30% say no, and 10% say yes. So I'm glad you're here. So let's get these numbers higher for you. Can you recall a time when you were flourishing? Now, really interesting is that 78% people say that they do remember a time. So that's useful, isn't it, Nick, in terms of being able to reflect back on that? Like what you were saying earlier about if you've done something before that you have that experience and you're able to refer back to it in some way, so that if you can flourish at one point, it is possible that you can also recreate a lot of the environment or the values, etc., that you had at that time.
Yes, and I
I
think
know.
that coming back to that idea of psychological flexibility,
Hmm.
being thoughtful of how what it means to flourish might shift with age and context and life stages and things of that nature, right? So if you look back to a point in your life, oh, I was flourishing because I was newly married and didn't have kids and money was plentiful and I was crushing it at work and seeing friends all the time and physically fit and
Hmm.
it's 30, 40, 50 years later, Well, that might not be the marker. That might be, I've got a healthy family. I get to, my spouse is still around. I get to, garden every day and kind of ground myself in nature. And these things are going to shift over time. And that's again, going back to subjectivity.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got to have some core anchors in terms of values and sense of purpose and things like that. But you can also get boxed in by those if there's not a little bit of flexibility in how you relate to your own ability to flourish.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point because it could be that almost nostalgia that is blocking you from flourishing now, as
Sure,
in you think
sure.
that you need those conditions, whereas it's working with where you are and what you have right now is a huge part of being able to create um well-being. Yeah. Okay,
Yep.
so in terms of, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about motivation because I know that you have this whole
Sure.
concept of intrinsic motivation. So, do you feel high or low levels of motivation to achieve your goals? And we've got a nice balance here. So, 48% of people, we've got a highly motivated audience, really are saying yes, they have high, and then 52% are saying low. I'll come back to that in a minute. I'll just finish the polls and then we'll talk about intrinsic motivation. But do you have a regular activity that enables you to enter into the flow state? And 64% say they do, and 36% say no. Do you believe in luck? Because I know luck is something else that you often speak about. And 71% say yes, 29% say no. And then just in terms of that eudaimonia and hedonism or hedonia, does your happiness derive from pleasure or meaning or both? And 4% say pleasure, 20% say meaning, and 76% say both. And that's really what we
Hmm.
were sort of saying earlier, wasn't it? That idea of it not being an either or situation. It's kind of being able
The
to
both and.
it's yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
So what is intrinsic motivation, Nick?
So the simplest way to think about this is to kind of imagine a spectrum or a scale in your head, say with it'd be 6 points, right? So on the extreme end of this scale, you've got a motivation. So what is a motivation? It's a lack of motivation. It's the absence of motivation. You don't really value much. You don't feel much efficacy, meaning you don't think you're capable. There's just really nothing driving you whatsoever. So what do? You do not act, right? There is no volition. So then the next four, as you move to the side, are under the extrinsic motivation category, but they're moving progressively towards intrinsic incrementally, right? So the most pure form of extrinsic motivation is compliance, right? I'm doing this behavior because someone has compelled me to, or really forced me to, not a positive compulsion, maybe even a
In
negative
school or
compulsion.
something? What could we say,
Right.
Nick?
So,
Yeah.
yeah, this is the carrot and stick method, right? And there's a place for it. Again, anyone that's been a parent, right, and bribed their kid with candy or whatever, whatever it might be, has engaged in extrinsic motivation, probably to some degree of success. So what you've got there is like, well, okay, I value avoiding the negative result of not doing the thing, or I somewhat value the positive result of doing the thing. And then as you move along this spectrum, it becomes less about the result and more about the internal sense of self and values and interests and enjoyment. It becomes more about the experience itself, right? So this would be why those of you that answered the poll about having an activity that you consistently experience flow in, you are likely highly intrinsically motivated to engage in that experience. Why? They both lend themselves to autotelic experiences, experiences that in and of themselves are the reward, not about a result or compliance or the carrot or the stick, something extrinsic, external from the self. Again, it's not an either or, it's a both and. But typically, those of us that kind of find things that are deeply satisfying and that we keep coming back to and keep scratching the itch and tend to do really well in, the
Mhm.
profile is going to be predominantly intrinsic, right, over extrinsic. But there's 100% a place for both.
Okay, okay. So would you recommend that people like do focus more on the intrinsic, if you like, to have a more long-term sort of motivation. Otherwise, it could kind of run out, if you like, or back to that dopamine going up and going back down. Or is there a sense of how, when you align it with your values, and yes, there may be an external sort of reward, right? But it's not the focus. It's just a perk perhaps that comes along.
Perks are fine. Dependence is where you run into problems, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So if something is purely extrinsic
Yeah.
because of dependence upon that reward, right? Then motivation is limited. And again, we mentioned schooling, right? Long history in education. This is where you see it most obviously. If the mark is
Mhm.
the only thing that matters to the student, bare minimum effort. Do enough to get the mark and then stop. And
Mhm.
that's quite logical, by the
Mhm.
way. Why would you go above and beyond for something that you don't actually value? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So then why do people go above and beyond? Well, when you look at intrinsic, that tends to be more oriented around purpose, around a desire for mastery and a desire for increased competency. That's often associated with interest and enjoyment and efficacy and achievement and all these things that sort of right
Mhm.
can compound over the source of time. And at the same time, you mentioned, I think, a really important piece, which is alignment with values, right? If it's values aligned, it's extrinsic, and it makes you feel good, there's nothing wrong with being extrinsically motivated to pursue that, right? If it's the only thing that matters and we're dependent upon that reward, we've got to watch out, right? Because that's not going to last forever. We're going to adapt to it, we're going to get used to it, and then motivation is going to have gone bye-bye on us, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
certainly it doesn't hurt to kind of dangle a carrot out here and there to kind of make us go a little faster, jump a little higher, push a little harder.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. That's really helpful. That's really helpful. And there's a couple of questions, Nick, that I'm just going to have a look at that have
Yeah.
come in. So being self-reliant and able to solve my own problems, not overly dependent on others. Or maybe that's just a comment. I don't think it's I thought it was a question. Yeah, maybe not. Not to worry. If there is a question, now is the time to ask it, because I'll be able to put it to Nick before we finish up. Um, but just to tell us a little bit more about the science of luck, because I think, again, there's the joke, the luck of the Irish, that we have this thing about being lucky. What is the science on luck at the moment? What is the most up-to-date science on this?
So I'll preempt my answer with the caveat of I'm not sure this is up to date, right? But this is as recently as I've read a lot of the good research from Richard Wiseman, who is a luck scientist. He's got a great book called The Luck Factor. I'm sure he has more updated research. But the essence of it is as follows: there's four traits of generally lucky people, right? It's not just randomity, it is somewhat correlated with behavior. So, what are those four behaviors of lucky people, and why is that relevant to a field like optimal functioning, mindsets, positive psychology, those sorts of things? First and foremost, they notice and take chances. I say, well, that seems kind of general and vague. Well, if you're going to different restaurants, if you're taking different routes to work, if you're saying yes to that party you don't feel like going to, if you are applying for the job, if you're going on that date, whatever it might be, it is simple math. You are creating more chances for dots to connect, right?
Okay.
First, to
Yes.
collect them, but second, for them also to connect.
Okay.
Second trait is that lucky people generally they set positive expectations that
Mhm.
turn into self-fulfilling prophecies. And the self-fulfilling prophecy is a technical term. You start with beliefs, those beliefs lead to behaviors that make the beliefs true, right? But it's belief oriented, right? And
Mhm.
so setting positive expectations, well,
Mhm.
this will generally go well. It's worth having a go. It's worth taking the swing. It's worth making the phone call. right?
Yeah.
Again, simple math creates more opportunity for good things to happen.
Okay.
The third trait is personally my favorite, although I think the most abstract. The third trait of lucky people is that they trust their gut, they follow their intuition.
Okay.
The fourth is that they're resilient. They can benefit find. They can be anti fragile. They can transform the bad or the unpleasant into something good, right? And figure out a way to kind of frame it or flip it on its head. And so the reason I think all four of those, they're all interesting on their own, but when you bundle them up, notice and take chances. Well, who does that? Optimists, people who think things will generally go well.
Mm-hmm.
Set positive expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Optimists, trust your intuition. Optimists, right? Be resilient. Core foundation of that is optimism. People that believe things will generally go well. Does
Mm-hmm.
that mean Pollyanna-ish? No. We should not always be optimistic, right? If I wanted to come, participate in this talk in person, I'm sitting here in Western Michigan in the middle of the United States. Should I have been optimistic that I could swim to Ireland to do so? No, I should not have. I should have been pessimistic, right? It's not an either or. We've said it, a couple times tonight. It's a both and, but it
Mm-hmm.
seems to be that lucky people have a predisposition to optimism as a mindset and a behavioral style, right? Predominantly what we'd call approach behaviors. I'm going to go out as something good might happen from it. I might think evolution. I might get berries. I might, get that meal for the night
Mm-hmm.
instead of avoidance behaviors. I'm going to stay in or not do that thing because it might be a saber-toothed tiger, right?
Yeah.
You're just increasing the chances that you'll get the reward.
Yeah, yeah. So when you say like a predisposition, isn't it fair to say also that we can cultivate that, just even having
Mm-hmm.
knowing that knowledge, those four different factors that we can start to embrace them, to push ourselves to step out of our comfort zones, for example, to go to that party we don't feel like going to be more approach based and to really um use that information, use that knowledge to challenge ourselves essentially, even though it may feel uncomfortable. That because I think it is very uplifting and optimistic, if you like, to know that we can, that we have that within us. And I think that's what I would love for people to take away from this evening is that you can, in a sense, not necessarily create your own luck, but you can create your own, let's say, ability to be lucky, if you like. Do you know what I mean? That you can put yourself in positions, as you say, it's simple maths. You're going to be more likely for positive things to occur by being more risk, within reason, of course. Everything is in moderation or in balance, but that you have that um self-belief to put yourself forward. And I think it goes back again. You can just see the full circle there, Nick. It goes back to the quote of people selling themselves short, and how, when we don't do that, when we do actually um, allow ourselves to embrace even the idea that we have some kind of input, and we do have such a huge input into the well-being of our lives, and how lucky we are. And I've never heard those four things, Nick. I love it. I think it's really helpful, and I think we need to um Orla says, I feel lucky I read your email this morning. And there we go. It's like you read the email, but you actually clicked on the registration, right? So that's the pro, is not the approach. Like you can see the email, but you might not necessarily click on it. So I think that's a really good example of how
Yep.
we create our own, ability to be lucky, if you like. So Nick, look, it's coming up to 8:30. I want to thank you so much for your time. I'm really, really very, very grateful. You've just shared so much and so helpful. Um, what would you
My
say, just to,
pleasure.
oh, thank you. On a practical level, to sum it all up with our conversation, what do you think would be the maybe even one thing people could do watching here this evening that would sort of bring it together for them to unleash their best selves? What would you say?
Yeah, we always, so at our podcast, Flourish FM, we always finish off with one kind of our flourishing question, right? What's the one thing you'd suggest to people, which is a difficult position to put, these awesome researchers in. But I'll kind of, return the favor. If you want to be able to change behavior, change mindset, catch beliefs when you're engaging with them and reframe them and shift self-talk, catch feelings. We always say that being anti-fragile or flourishing is top down, bottom up, outside in. Top down is thinking about your thinking. Bottom up is catching physiological sensations. It's interoceptive, right? And outside in is about people living in your environments. You can't do any of it if you cannot catch the present moment and be aware of it. You can't do any of it, right? And so if there's people on the call that haven't started this already, finding simple, realistic, habitual ways of engaging in the practice of mindfulness. And I'm not using that synonymously with meditation. Mindfully drinking your morning tea or your cup of coffee, mindfully having your meal, mindfully sitting in traffic and leaving your phone on the side instead of engaging, and running from the boredom. It's mindfulness practice over and over and over again. And from there, you can build emotional intelligence and habits and routines and do your relationship dashboard and reflect on meaning. But it's got to start with the present moment.
Couldn't agree more, Nick. And that's, I suppose, where it always comes back to. It always starts there and comes all the way back full circle. So thank you for that. And on that note, I am holding a special retreat called The Power of Presence. If you haven't already registered, you can do so. And I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you so much. We'll be back next month. The date for next month is the Monday, the October the 9th. So the guest will be announced next week on the 18th of September. We'll let you know who that is going to be. Really exciting guest coming up as well. And please do share this with family and friends if you find them useful. They are provided for free. The idea is really to help you as much as we possibly can. We're very grateful to those of you who can and do donate, and you can still do so if you haven't already. So thank you so, so much. And Nick, again, thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day. You can see it's getting dark here
My
in Ireland
pleasure.
as we've
Yep.
chatted.
Yep.
So lots of love, Nick, and lots of love to everybody for coming. Thank you so much, and good night.
Thank you. Good night,
Bye, Nick.
everyone.
Thank you.
Take
Bye.
care.